The title of this lecture might be a bit surprising because it seems that so far we've been doing nothing more but discussing various types of meaning. So first we divided the meaning conveyed into said and implicated. Then we introduced a threefold division into linguistic form, what is said, that is the explicature of an utterance, and finally the implicature of an utterance. But still it seems that a bit more finely grained picture of the types of meaning conveyed by an utterance can be provided. So first I would like you to have a look at the following examples. Ben is a New Zealander, so he loves rugby. Ben is a New Zealander, after all he loves rugby. Ben is a New Zealander, nevertheless he loves rugby. Although Ben is a New Zealander, he loves rugby. So if you look at these examples, you have to agree that the truth conditional content, that is the propositional meaning of every single one of them, is the same. So they do not differ in terms of their truth propositional meaning. However, certain words introduce minor modifications into the interpretation of these utterances. So the audience does not understand all of them in the same way. Similarly, if you look at the following two, it was Anne who found the cat. It was the cat that Anne found. They do not differ in terms of the propositional content. The truth conditions for both of them are the same, but in fact you interpret them in a slightly different way. So the emphasis is put on a different element. The focus is different, okay? So you have to interpret them, you have to understand them in a slightly different way. Now, again, it was Anne who played Summertime at the Christmas concert. It was Summertime that Anne played at the Christmas concert. It was at the Christmas concert that Anne played Summertime. So the same problem. All these are clapped sentences, but they are somehow arranged in a different way, and therefore they are understood in a different way. So, as you can see, there are certain elements of meaning that are not part of the truth conditional content of an utterance, but still have to be interpreted somehow, and we have to account for them somehow. When talking about relevance theory, I've tried to emphasize the importance of inference in the process of understanding, in the process of comprehending utterances. And here, as you can see, we are one more time back to the assumptions of relevance theory in a way. So linguistic semantics does not deliver truth-evaluable propositional representations, but semantic logical forms, which are then taken as input to pragmatic inferences constrained by the principle of relevance. So linguistic semantics offers us a blueprint, and then we fill it in with the appropriate content inferentially, contextually, pragmatically. The result is a set of communicated assumptions which might be either the product of encoding an inference, so this is the explicature, so just we establish the explicit meaning of an utterance, or they might be the product of purely inferential processing, and then we get the implicit meaning, that is implicature. Now, the question for linguistic semantics is not what contribution an expression makes to truth conditions, but what kind of contribution it makes to pragmatic inference, what kind of cognitive information it encodes. So if we are back to the linguistic form, then we have to analyze the constituent elements in terms of the contribution each of them makes to the pragmatic inference, that is, whether it is the instruction referring to the very content of an utterance, or whether it is the instruction referring to certain process, to derivation of particular conclusions. It seems that there are two distinct processes involved in utterance interpretation. One is decoding, and the other is inferencing. The first is an input to the second. The second involves the construction of conceptual representations, conceptual, in other words, propositional representations, that is the very content, which enter into inferential computations. Thus, linguistic form could encode not only the constituents of conceptual representations, but also information that constrains the computations in which the conceptual representations are involved. I will try to rephrase it. So, if you look at an utterance, you may notice that there are certain elements that are responsible for the very meaning that is conveyed, conceptual meaning, the content, but there are also elements that instruct you how to process this particular piece of information in relation to something that appeared previously, for instance, or in relation to something that is likely to follow. So, if there is a number of sentences, okay, then you have to connect one to another in some way. Okay, so these propositional contents of particular sentences have to be logically connected, and the instruction for that connection, for the cohesiveness of a particular discourse, a fragment of discourse, may be encoded in a linguistic form. So there might be elements that simply instruct you how to compute the conceptual representations, in other words, what to do with them to deliver a meaningful piece of discourse. So linguistic form can, on the one hand, encode conceptual information, but on the other, it can also encode procedural information. It is a truism to say that there is a gap between what the sentence encodes and the interpretation that is recovered by the hearer, but we will just try to show what it means when we refer to the difference between, to this distinction between conceptual and procedural information. I want you to have a look at the following two sentences. Tom can open base safe. He knows the combination. And I hope that if you look at these sentences as they are, two possible interpretations come to your mind. One is Tom can open base safe, so he knows the combination. And the other might be Tom can open base safe, after all he knows the combination. So as you can see, these two interpretations, or the choice of one of the interpretations, depends on whether the second sentence is understood as evidence for the proposition expressed, or whether it is a conclusion derived from the first sentence. Okay? So if it is a conclusion derived from the first sentence, then it is Tom can open base safe, so he knows the combination. He must know the combination if he can open base safe. On the other hand, Tom can open base safe. Obviously he can, because he knows the combination. So after all, he knows the combination. This is evidence versus conclusion. Again, mind you that in terms of the conceptual constituents, these two sentences do not differ from each other. However, they can be processed in a different way. If you look now at the sentences below, that is, with so and with after all, you can see that there are certain linguistic forms that can facilitate the process of computation, that is, in general, that can facilitate processing, okay, that you know how to join, how to logically combine the two utterances. Such words as so and after all can be called procedural encodings. So they are linguistic expressions which encode information about which of the two potential inferential procedures yields the intended interpretation. The use of an expression which encodes a procedure for identifying the intended cognitive effects is consistent with the speaker's aim of achieving relevance for a minimum cost in processing. Mind you that sometimes the speaker may not provide the audience with a particular hint, with a particular clue as to the interpretation, because the context may be manifest enough so that the addressee knows how to interpret the two utterances. But if the speaker is not quite sure whether the addressee will be able to interpret the two utterances in the way intended, he may facilitate the process by providing a linguistic encoding of his intention. Now, if you look at the next example, I think you should accept this paper for the conference. It is well written and it's got wonderful examples. Moreover, it is right on the conference theme. So moreover can be used in this particular context, but mind you that but cannot be. It does not make sense. You think you should accept this paper for the, I think you should accept this paper for the conference. It is well written and it's got wonderful examples, but it is right on the conference theme. It does not make sense. So mind you that it is not enough to know the meaning of these expressions. You have to know where they can be used. So you have to know the context in which these expressions are appropriate. So in that sense, such linguistic forms as moreover, or but, or after all, differ from other encoded constituents of the utterance. So we may conclude that procedural encodings introduce constraints on implicatures, which means that they direct us they prompt us how to interpret a particular sentence, whether it is an additional piece of evidence, or whether it is to be treated as a conclusion from the previous utterance. So, in other words, we may say that procedural encodings are constraints or introduce constraints on implicatures. Okay? And the notion of a procedural constraint on implicatures can be applied to the analysis of non-truth conditional discourse markers. But the notion of procedural meaning can be extended to expressions and constructions which encode constraints on the recovery of explicatures too. Some of these are mood indicators, illocutionary particles, attitudinal particles, and they are analyzed as encoding constraints on the inferential processes involved in the recovery of higher level explicatures. Okay, I will be back to that in a second now. I just want to be back one more time to the first part of that sentence. So, discourse markers are such expressions as so, after all, moreover, but, and many more. And, as you've probably noticed, they are not part of the truth conditional content. So whether you use them or whether you do not, this fact does not affect the truth condition of the utterance that are embedded under them. Okay? So they are non-truth conditional and procedural, but encoded, obviously. They introduce constraints on implicatures. So we may say that they contribute, the meaning conveyed by them contributes to the derivation of implicatures. On the other hand, there might be some expressions that whose function is more or less the same, that is, they convey some kind of instruction directed to the audience, but they contribute to the explicit level of communication. So they constrain the recovery of explicatures. And here they are. These are mood indicators, illocutionary particles, attitudinal particles. And they may, for instance, affect the recovery of higher level explicatures. So a higher level explicature is an attitude of the speaker towards what he's saying, towards what follows. Okay, so if we say Peter is a genius, we may say that Peter is a genius conveys the content, the truth propositional content, but then ha, which is that kind of attitudinal particle, conveys the attitude of the speaker. So the speaker does not think that Peter is a genius. In this example, the equation between procedural and non-truth conditional meaning is maintained. So ha is some kind of procedural information directed to the addressee, and now the addressee knows how to interpret Peter is a genius. So Peter is a genius is explicit, okay, but the attitude of the speaker is that of disbelief. So the speaker doubts very much that Peter is a genius, in fact. So you get the piece of information, Peter is a genius, plus the attitude of the speaker. And this attitude of the speaker is conveyed by this particle. This particle does not possess any conceptual meaning. I hope you can see that, because you cannot really say what ha means. But in this particular context, it is appropriate, and it is a meaningful signal for the audience. So the audience can get the attitude of the speaker. So now perhaps we can relate the procedural meaning to truth conditionality. That is, we have to decide whether the meaning that encodes procedures, that encodes instructions, has to be non-truth conditional, or perhaps it may also be truth conditional. So if we are back to discourse markers, such as but, moreover, therefore, so, after all, that introduce constraints on implicatures, we know that they represent non-truth conditional meaning. Now, mood indicators, illocutionary particles, attitudinal particles, again, represent non-truth conditional meanings, and this is, they introduce constraints on explicatures. But not all procedural encodings would be examples of non-truth conditional meanings, and personal pronouns constitute a very good example of the procedural encoding that is truth conditional at the same time. So mind you that if there is an utterance, a sentence like she saw him, okay, she does not carry a conceptual meaning. It is just, let's say, the key to the conceptual meaning. So we can interpret it that some female saw some male. Okay, so she and him are sort of empty conceptually. They simply narrow down the space within which we can find the appropriate referent. But we cannot say that they are not part, that these two pronouns are not part of the conceptual content, because once we find the referent and then say Kate saw Peter, then obviously Kate and Peter do contribute to the truth conditional meaning. It is part of these two names are part of the content. So in the same way, these two pronouns are part of the content, of the linguistic content, truth conditional content. But they are not fully conceptual. So linguistic decoding of she saw him yields a skeletal conceptual representation, and the skeletal perceptual representation has to be filled in with a conceptual content. So we may conclude that pronouns do not encode constituents of a conceptual representation, but procedures for constructing such representations. They do contribute to truth conditional content, but only in the sense that they constrain the hearer's search for the representations of their reference. Thus, not all procedural meaning is non-truth conditional. So she is the key to the concept. For example, Kate Brown promised to help us. She promised to help us. Kate Brown promised to help us. So a personal pronoun is procedural, but truth conditional. So now perhaps we can discuss varieties of non-truth conditional meaning. So on the one hand, non-truth conditional meaning can be represented by linguistically encoded meaning. And here we may mention discourse markers such as but we may also mention cleft sentences. So we simply change the structure of a sentence, and this changing structure, this changed structure is an instruction for us how to interpret the sentence, that is, what is more important, what is less important, and it is obviously non-truth conditional, that kind of instruction. On the other hand, non-truth conditional meaning is simply represented by implicit meaning, by the implicature that we simply derive contextually. Now, perhaps that kind of meaning is not of any interest for us anymore. We've discussed it in details many times before. So now we'll just concentrate on linguistically encoded non-truth conditional meaning. So here there are discourse connectives, as in Ben is a New Zealander, so he loves rugby. After all, he loves rugby. Nevertheless, he loves rugby. Although Ben is a New Zealander, he loves rugby. So again, the structure and although belong to what we call procedural encoding. Even Ben likes rugby. Ben likes rugby too. Again, even and to are procedural encodings. As you can see, they are interpreted somehow, but they are not part of the truth conditional meaning of Ben likes rugby. What you get in terms of the content is just that Ben likes rugby, and additionally you get some piece of information, directing you to the intended interpretation. So this is just one type of non-truth conditional encoded meaning. Then perhaps sentence illocutionary adverbials and parentheticals. Fortunately, they are not going to ask Tom. Sadly, or frankly, or regrettably, they are not going to ask Tom. So what you get here is the information that they are not going to ask Tom, which is the truth conditional content of that utterance, plus some information as to the attitude of the speaker, whether the speaker considers it to be a fortunate event or a sad event, or whether the speaker is saying that frankly, or whether the speaker regrets it. So two pieces of information, so to say, and obviously the attitude of the speaker is not part of the truth conditional content. So we may say that that kind of encoding is non-truth conditional. It is not procedural, we'll talk about it shortly, but it is certainly not truth conditional. Now, if you look at, they are, I suppose, going to ask Tom, or they are, I warn you, going to ask Tom, or they are, I bet, going to ask Tom. I suppose, I warn, I bet represent what we call parentheticals. So again, some remarks expressing the speaker's intention, but they do not contribute to the truth conditional sentence, to the main sentence. What you get as the main piece of information is that they are not going to ask Tom. Plus, you get the attitude of the speaker, what the speaker thinks, what the speaker's intention is. Here you have more examples of non-truth conditional meaning. We've deprived you of Tom's company tonight, but the same can be phrased with spared. We spared Tom's company. We spared you Tom's company tonight. Where's Stanley? Surely he has forgotten to come. Surely the bastard has forgotten to come. So again, if you look at these sentences and you compare the two versions, they do not differ in terms of the content. Perhaps you get the additional meaning that informs you about the attitude of the speaker, but this is not part of the truth conditional meaning. Now, if you look at je t'aime and je vous aime, again, in terms of the information that is conveyed, the meaning is absolutely the same. I love you, that's it. And additionally, you may derive a conclusion as to the mutual relationships between the speaker and the addressee, as to the status of the speakers, as to the status of the participants of that encounter. So, mind you again that there are certain nuances of meaning that can be conveyed, even if though they are not part of the transconditional meaning, and they have to be explained somehow, they have to be accounted for in the linguistic analysis somewhere. There must be place for them. Now, they do not seem to be part of said, if said is equated with the transconditional content, and they are not quite part of the implicit method, that is implicature. So we have to find a level at which we can somehow account for them. Now, another example, constructions that cannot be described as being true or false. So here there are imperatives, interrogatives, and exclamatives. Turn off the computer. Have you turned the computer off? What a terrible noise. So again, if you think about the propositional content, it is the same in the imperative structure as in the interrogative structure. Okay, but the sentences are not processed, that is, are not interpreted in the same way. So the mood conveys some kind of instruction for the addressee as to how to process, how to understand the utterance. And then he's a cook, huh? He's a good cook, eh? He's a good cook, huh? So in it is you somehow render it into a question. He's a good cook. It appears to be an affirmative sentence, but if you add this particle you simply convert it into the interrogative structure. So again, you somehow change the intention of the speaker, or you signal the intention of the speaker procedurally. Mind you that this conversion does not affect the transconditional content of the utterance, which is still that a particular person is a good cook. And the same is obviously in the next one. He's a good cook, huh? Which means I do not believe that he's a good cook. And in the next one, oh, the weather is awful. Oh, you're here already. So oh is perhaps more elusive in meaning. If you compare O to the previous two, and ha, you can see the difference. And ha are more specific. They are always used in the same meaning, in the same context. That is, A is always for a question, and ha is always for expressing some doubts. Whereas O can be used in a variety of different contexts. It may be surprise, it may be admiration, it may be distrust, whatever. So it is possible, obviously, each time to interpret it correctly in the context, and you know what it signals in a particular context, but it will be more difficult to pin it down, pin down the meaning that it always expresses, because this meaning is changeable. But still, it seems to me that O is some kind of procedural encoding. It may seem to you that non-truth conditional meaning is always procedural, which is not the case. So perhaps now we'll try to discuss the difference between conceptual and procedural discourse markers, and then you will see that also conceptual meaning, that is the meaning encoded concepts, does not have to be truth conditional. So discourse markers do not fall into a single category from the semantic point of view, because not all cases of non-truth conditional meaning are procedural encodings. Some expressions, analyzed as discourse connectives, behave more like sentence adverbials. For example, in other words, you are banned. So you are banned is the content of that utterance, the propositional meaning of that utterance. In other words, is again some kind of instruction. So it is a discourse marker, or a discourse connective, and it is not part of the truth conditional meaning. But mind you that it is not devoid of the semantic meaning, and you can easily compare it to the sentence, she asked me to try and put it in other words. So here, in that sentence, in other words, is part of the truth conditional content. And in these two sentences, if you compare them, the same concept is encoded. So you cannot claim that in the second sentence it is conceptual and in the first sentence it is not conceptual. We may conclude that in other words is always conceptual, but in the first sentence it does not. The whole expression does not contribute to the transconditional content of the utterance, whereas in the second it does. On the other hand, if you look at the following examples, what time should we leave? Well, the train leaves at 11:30. You haven't done it well. You cannot claim that well conveys the same conceptual content in both sentences. So the first well is not equivalent to the second well. In the second sentence it is both conceptual and transconditional, but in the first sentence it is neither transconditional nor conceptual. Now perhaps we'll try to find some other expressions that are also conceptual, though non-transconditional. And here we should discuss sentence adverbials, sentence adverbs, such as, for instance, unfortunately. So, unfortunately, Tom is not hungry. If you look at this utterance, unfortunately, Tom is not hungry, again, you get two pieces of information. One is that Tom is not hungry, and the other is what the speaker thinks about it. So the speaker thinks that it is very unfortunate that Tom is not hungry. So unfortunately does not contribute to the transconditional content of the utterance, Tom is not hungry. But we cannot say that it does not convey a propositional representation, that it is devoid of any concept, okay, because it is conceptual. If we say it was very unfortunate, then obviously unfortunate is a concept, and then it is part of the transconditional content. And in the same vein, if you look at the next one, seriously, you'll have to leave, for instance, serious, or in confidence, she did it. Okay, so seriously is again a sentence adverb which might be paraphrased, I'm saying that seriously, I'm serious, she did it, or you'll have to leave. Okay, so the main meaning conveyed is you will have to leave, or she did it, but additionally I'm serious about it. Okay, but again, so it is not part of the transconditional content, but we cannot say that it is not conceptual. So seriously and in confidence encode constituents of conceptual representation, even though they do not contribute to the transconditions of the utterance. Such sentence adverbials have synonymous verbal phrase adverbial counterparts. It is not the case for but, after all, or well. So could you please look at this example? You may say, seriously, you'll have to leave. He looked at me seriously, okay? Or in confidence, you will have to leave. Or you may match it with, she looked at me seriously. So, as you can see, if you compare these two, seriously and in confidence are either part of the transconditional content, he looked at me seriously, or not, seriously, you'll have to leave. But in both sentences, they are conceptual, they encode the same concept. Within non-transconditional meaning, we've established a distinction between procedural and conceptual meaning. And now we'll try to point to some differences between procedural and conceptual encodings. So one will be semantic complexity. Sentence adverbials can be semantically complex, but expressions such as so and but, which were classified as procedural encodings, cannot combine with other expressions. So you may say in total absolute confidence, instead of in confidence, or simply confidentially, she's been promoted. You may say speaking quite frankly, instead of frankly, I don't think he's right. You may say putting it more brutally, you are sacked. So as you can see, all these sentence adverbials are very, very complex in these sentences, but you cannot say, you cannot make discus connectives so complex. So this semantic compositionality is only possible for constituents of conceptual representations, but not procedural. It is not possible for procedural encodings. So you cannot say Tom likes pop totally, however, and prefers Renaissance art. Tom likes pop art in total contrast and prefers Renaissance art. So you can use it with in total contrast, which more or less conveys the same kind of procedure as however. And as you can see, in total contrast is semantically complex, but you cannot make however more complex. You cannot say totally however. It simply does not work. You may argue that procedural encodings can combine in some way, but I hope you will notice that they do not combine in the same way as conceptual expressions. So you may say, the cat left footprints all over the manuscript, but after all, he cannot read. So here there is a combination of but and after all, so two discrete markers together. The exam scripts are covered in mud, so he must have walked over them too. So here there is some kind of combination of so and to, but it is a different kind of combination that you observed for sentence adverbials. Now, another difference, perhaps, to say that an expression does not encode a concept is to say that it does not encode a constituent which undergoes the inferential process involved in developing logical forms into explicatures. It does not encode a constituent of a representation that undergoes the inferential processes involved in the development of fragmentary utterances. And here I want you to compare coffee and nevertheless. So perhaps I will explain what is written down there. If I say coffee and you know the context, you can develop this linguistic form coffee into something more complete. You can develop it into a full sentence, a complete sentence. So for example, you can develop it into what we need is coffee. I should buy some coffee, or I should come to have a cup of coffee with you. It may be any development depending on the context. But if I say nevertheless, you cannot develop it, you cannot somehow fill in this skeletal form, and you cannot make a complete sentence out of it. So that's the difference between conceptual and procedural encoding. So coffee means nothing in terms of the procedure. Coffee is just a fragment of a longer thought, and on the basis of this expression coffee plus contextual assumptions, you can build a whole sentence. Whereas on the basis of nevertheless, you cannot build the whole sentence. Obviously, we can imagine the situation of nevertheless uttered by a university professor to the explanation given by a student for the failure to submit the assessed work. And then the professor says, nevertheless, which means, well, but I still think you should have tried to satisfy my requirements. Yes, that is true, but it is what we get is rather the conclusion that we derive from the contextual assumptions, from the situation, and it is not the development of nevertheless. Nevertheless points to the direction in which we should go to find the appropriate interpretation. But it is not the development of the very word. We do not get the sentence built around the expression nevertheless. So this is also the difference, I believe that this points to the difference between coffee, which is conceptual, and nevertheless, which is procedural, which simply helps you to compute. So if we are to establish the status of a particular form, if we are to say whether it represents a linguistic encoding or conceptual encoding, we have to answer the question whether it is a development of the linguistic form or sorry, not whether it is, whether we can make a development of the linguistic form into something more complete, like a sentence, or not. So the hearer is expected to use contextual assumptions and pragmatically constrained inference to develop a linguistically encoded semantic representation into an enriched propositional representation. So possible explicatures that you may derive, that you may get on the basis of the linguistic form coffee might be, it's time for coffee, we need to buy some coffee, coffee should be included on the shopping list. On the other hand, if you think of nevertheless, there is only a set of assumptions that the hearer might recover. The student should have handed in some of the work. The student's circumstances do not justify bending the rules. The student has not tried hard enough. But mind you that none of these is a development of development of the linguistic form of nevertheless. It is just a set of assumptions that are activated by nevertheless, but this is not the development of nevertheless. So we may say that nevertheless and other discourse markers or other procedural encodings introduce constraints on assumptions. So whereas the assumptions for coffee are all a development of the concept encoded by coffee, none of the assumptions in nevertheless can be regarded as a development of a concept encoded by nevertheless. Here the role of the expression is different. It constrains the range of assumptions. It does not matter what assumptions a hearer constructs, provided they achieve relevance in the way prescribed by nevertheless. So perhaps now you can see the importance of the context, that is, it is not the knowledge of the meaning of the word that is important if you want to use a word like nevertheless, but it is the knowledge of the context in which it can be used. So this is what characterizes procedural encodings. It is conceivable that the speaker's intention, in the case of nevertheless, might not include the construction of an assumption at all. So the discourse connective serves as a means of activating the right kind of cognitive effects. And here there is an example. Speaker and hearer are subjected to a long and angry speech by someone who then leaves the room slamming the door. And then one of them says, well. So it means nothing, in fact, but it activates particular contextual assumptions in the addressee. So it activates particular cognitive effects. In a way, it directs the addressee to where he should find this cognitive, where he should look for these cognitive effects. It is difficult to identify any proposition the speaker of well might have intended to express. But knowing the meaning of the expression enables us to say something specific about the range of cognitive effects that he intended to achieve. So coffee may be classified as a fragmentary utterance, and in the case of coffee, the hearer is expected to construct an assumption which has the concept encoded by coffee as a constituent, which yields cognitive effects. Which cognitive effects are derived by the hearer of coffee depends entirely on the context. There is no linguistically encoded constraint on these cognitive effects. Knowing the meaning of coffee does not help much. Now, nevertheless is not cannot be treated as a fragmentary utterance. Okay, so knowing the meaning of nevertheless, that is a context in which can be used, is very helpful because it activates a very specific range of cognitive effects. Now, non-truth conditional sentence adverbials such as unfortunately or seriously or frankly may be used as fragmentary utterances. So, unfortunately is related to coffee, as the hearer is expected to construct explicatures which include the concept encoded by unfortunately, which is, it is unfortunate that the speaker has a lot of homework. In the sentence, unfortunately, I've got a lot of homework to do. So the meaning of unfortunately plays no role in determining how the proposition is relevant. This is determined by the context. Now this is going to be a digression, but I just want you to notice that procedural encodings can be or should be associated with inferential processes, and the examples that follow are to convince you of that. So according to relevance theory, speakers may be reporting thoughts rather than words. Thought does not mean thought content, but also the attribution of a particular inferential process. So Peter thought that Mary had a holiday, so he should have one too. And mind you that this "so" is what Peter thinks. So this is the process, the inferential process that is attributed to Peter. So originally Peter thinks, Mary had a holiday, so I should have one too. So mind you that the speaker is not drawing an inference herself, but attributing a certain inference to Peter. So if I say Peter thought that Mary had a holiday, so he should have one too, this process of inferencing is attributed to Peter. Now, if you look at Sheila is rich, but she is unhappy, then but here is non-attributive. Okay, so it is used, it is my inference in a way. So how is the addressee to interpret this but in Sheila is rich but unhappy? So the hearer is intended to perform an inferential computation involving the explicit content and accessible contextual assumptions. The result is a conceptual representation. This conceptual representation is not encoded by but it is activated by it in the sense that it encodes the information about the inferential route the hearer should take in order to arrive at the intended conceptual representation. It sounds extremely complex, but it's very, very simple. The route. The hearer arrives at a conceptual representation that contradicts Sheila is happy. So we have Sheila is rich, but she's unhappy. Okay? So on the basis of Sheila is rich, the addressee should think that if she is rich, she is happy. And then, but contradicts this assumption. Okay? So now we know that Sheila, though Sheila is rich, she is unhappy. But to derive this conclusion, we have to bring to our mind the assumption that all rich people are happy. Okay, so on the basis of the sentence Sheila is rich but she's unhappy, we have to construct the assumption all rich people are happy, and then to contradict this assumption by means of but. This is what the speaker wanted to say. Okay, so the speaker can assume that her utterance will achieve relevance only if Sheila is happy is manifest to the hearer. That Sheila is happy is deducible from Sheila is rich, given the contextual assumption all rich people are happy. But now this assumption has to be cancelled and eliminated. So the role of but is to contradict the previous assumption, the assumption that, that was brought by the previous utterance. In the examples, Tom thinks that Sheila is rich but unhappy, or Peter thought that Mary had a holiday, so she should have one too. The speaker has made it explicit that he is attributing certain assumptions to someone. So Tom thinks that Sheila is rich but unhappy. Certain assumptions are attributed to Tom. And Peter thought that Mary had a holiday, so he should have one too. Certain assumptions are attributed to Peter. The relevance of the utterances simply lies in the information it communicates about what Tom and Peter believe. Examples such as these arise because it is possible for assumptions to be manifest as attributed assumptions, and the speaker will be understood to be using but and so in order to attribute an inference to someone else. So and but, discussed in the previous examples, are linguistically encoded constraints on relevance, that is, on processing, on the process of reasoning. And Blakemore claims that relevance theory can explain why linguistically encoded constraints on relevance represent particular types of functions. And now we are back to the classification of cognitive effects in relevance theory. There are three ways in which a particular input achieves a cognitive effects, and these three ways can be matched with discourse markers. So in other words, discourse markers seem to correspond to the three types of cognitive effects. So an input achieves a cognitive effect if it allows the derivation of a contextual assumptions, which means that it simply leads to the derivation of a conclusion. Then it strengthens an existing assumption, and it leads to the contradiction and elimination of an existing assumption. And it seems that discourse markers can be linked to these cognitive effects. So in other words, a discourse marker may help us to recognize the intention of the speaker, whether the speaker wants us to interpret a particular utterance as a conclusion from what has been said before, or whether it is additional piece of evidence for what has been said before, or whether we should perhaps revise what we have learned so far and eliminate one of the assumptions that we have had so far. Sometimes the context is obvious, and if the speaker says, Ben can open, Tom says, he knows the combination, we know that the second utterance is to be interpreted as giving evidence for the first, or we know that it is to be interpreted as a conclusion derived from the first. But sometimes the speaker cannot be quite sure whether we will be able to interpret two sentences properly, so he decides to help us. And then he may say, Ben can open, Tom say. After all, he knows the combination. And this after all signals that what follows is the strengthening of the previous assumption that Ben can open, Tom say. So it is additional piece of evidence. Or the speaker may say, Ben can open, Tom say. So he knows the combination, which is a derivation of the conclusion. Okay, it is a conclusion in a way. And in that way, if the speaker provides us with after all or so, or some other discourse markers for that matter, it is just easier for us to understand how these two utterances should be interpreted. Now, if you look at the next example, there is a pizza in the fridge, but leave some for tomorrow. The relevance of the second segment lies in the fact that it contradicts and eliminates an assumption presumed to have been made manifest. You can eat all the pizza. So, I'm hungry, Mum. What can I eat? There is a pizza in the fridge, full stop. Now, the child may derive a conclusion that he can help himself to the whole of the pizza. But then this assumption is contradicted, but leave some for tomorrow. Okay? So, but introduces the elimination of the previous assumption. So here, as you can see, all three effects are illustrated. The derivation of the contextual assumption, the strengthening of the assumption, and the elimination of the assumption. And it seems that all discourse markers perform one of these three functions. So the notion of a constraint on relevance allows us to distinguish three broad categories of discourse connectives, but unfortunately more finely grained distinctions between the meanings of the different expressions that fall into a particular category cannot be drawn. Because it happens so that sometimes but can be used, but some other expression that theoretically should belong to the same category, such as nevertheless or however, cannot be substituted. And it means that these categories of discourse markers should be further subdivided, and perhaps some other conditions must be satisfied for a particular discourse connective to be appropriate in the context. So here is just an example. Anna is a wonderful pianist, but she cannot sing. A perfect sentence. Anna is a wonderful pianist, nevertheless she cannot sing. This is okay as well. But did you get my article? Yes, but the last page is missing. This is perfect, but you cannot say yes, nevertheless, the last page is missing, so it is not acceptable. Even though but and nevertheless apparently serve the same function, that is, they are to eliminate the assumption. So here, as you can see, we should be a bit more specific about the context in which nevertheless can be used. Similarly, but and however, though often interchangeable, do not encode exactly the same constraint on interpretation. I suppose that it is summer in New Zealand now. Yes, it is. But the weather is not much better than here at the moment. Yes, it is. However, the weather is not much better than here at the moment. Both sentences are perfect, but if you look at the next pair, come on, we've got time for another coffee, but I've got a meeting at 2. This works, but you cannot say, however, I've got a meeting at 2. That does not work. And if you look at another pair of words, after all and indeed, then you will also see that they cannot be substituted. No, that is, they can, but not in all contexts. I think Verity should be the player of the match. After all, she scored all the goals. This is a very good sentence, but you cannot say, I think Verity should be the player of the match. Indeed, she scored all the goals. That is, you can, but then with indeed, it must be simply a different speaker. But if it is the same speaker that is saying that, you cannot say indeed here. Verity played well today. Indeed, she was brilliant. But you cannot say, after all, she was brilliant. It does not make much sense. Here are some more examples for you to analyze and to see the difference between the cognitive effect activated by but and the cognitive effect activated by after all. So Anne says, are you interested in seeing Sense and Sensibility? And Bob answers, costume dramas are usually boring, but it does have some great actors in it. So if Bob says costume dramas are usually boring, and then if we imagine that there is a full stop there, that he does not add anything more, then Anne will interpret it that Bob is not interested in seeing Sense and Sensibility. So this is the assumption that she might derive from what Bob has said. But this assumption is then cancelled, is eliminated, because Bob says, but it does have some great actors in it, which means that he's quite likely to watch the film. Okay, so the previous assumption is cancelled. And then Anne replies, it should be good, after all, Emma Thompson is in it. So it should be good. This is Anne's opinion, and then she wants to support it somehow, and the fact that Emma Thompson is in it is just a piece of evidence for Anne's opinion. Okay, so she's good. It should be good, after all, Emma Thompson is in it. So after all, introduces the strengthening of the assumption, introduces new evidence in favor of the first assumption. So what follows is just the same kind of explanation, but put in a more formal way. So Emma Thompson is in Sense and Sensibility. This is basic explicature. If Emma Thompson is in a film, the film is likely to be good. So this is the implicated premise. If the film is likely to be good, we should see it. This is implicated premise again. Sense and Sensibility is likely to be good is an implicated conclusion. We should go to see it. Implicated conclusion. So as you can see, the semantics of after all has played a guiding role in the accessing of the implicating premises. So one more time we'll just sum that up. Procedural encodings contribute to the implicit side of communication. The elements of meaning encoded by these expressions are procedural rather than conceptual. I mean, by these expressions I mean after all and indeed and moreover. So they are procedural rather than conceptual. They indicate, guide, constrain or direct the inferential phase of comprehension. They are effort-saving devices. Effort-saving because they facilitate processing. They stand in contrast to representational elements. Okay, so on the one hand there are representational elements, on the other hand there are computational elements, and they represent computational elements. Now, conceptual encodings may contribute to the explicit side of communication, and procedural encodings contribute to the implicit side. That is a position expressed by Blakemore, but Robin Carlston believes that, in fact, procedural encodings may play a guiding role in the full range of pragmatic tasks. So, pronouns and demonstratives are procedural but they do contribute to the explicit side. So I suppose that perhaps we should accept the view that procedural encodings may actually contribute to both implicit and explicit sides of communication. And here is just the illustration of procedural encoding contributing to the explicit side of communication. So pronouns and demonstratives encode procedural information. They reduce the search space for the pragmatic process of reference assignment. This is something that we've already discussed. So this is she, for instance. So various elements of linguistic forms, such as indicative, imperative, subjunctive, mood, or rising and falling intonation, inverted word order, some particles, please, let's, constrain the process of inferring the higher level explicatures, expressing the speaker's propositional attitude and speech act. It is important for us to know whether the speaker is asking, or whether the speaker is saying something, or whether the speaker is telling us to do something. Now, again, you may use the structure of an affirmative sentence with a rising intonation, and then this rising intonation is indicative of the speaker's intention, and the speaker's intention is to ask a question. So obviously prosody in general helps to process information, and prosody in the sense of stress, for instance, highlights particular elements. So we know what is important, what is less important. So we may say that intonation in general encodes procedural meaning. So it is a procedure, it is an instruction for us how we should interpret a particular sentence. It's just a facilitator in a way. So in open the window, please, the imperative morphology does not encode the concept of requesting or any other speech act type, nor does it encode anything conceptual concerning the speaker's attitude to the propositional content. The propositional content is hearer, open the window. But this imperative morphology provides a procedural constraint on the attitude and the speech act to be inferred. Okay, so this procedural constraint instructs us simply that it is desirable by the speaker, and it is potential. That is, a hearer can potentially satisfy this desire expressed by the speaker. So the mood is procedural. It is just the instruction what to do with this content of the utterance. So concluding this lecture, let us one more time discuss different combinations of semantic and pragmatic roles that specific linguistic devices may have. So we may analyze them in terms of what they encode, so whether they are conceptual or procedural, whether they encode conceptual or procedural information. We may analyze them in terms of the communicative level at which they function, so whether they contribute to the explicit level, that is explicature, or to the implicit level of the explicature. And finally, we may analyze them in terms of whether they contribute to the truth conditions of the utterance or not, so whether they are truth conditional or not, whether they are part of the propositional content or not. And if you look at the sentence, she doesn't like cats, but happily she has agreed to look after Fleabag, we can analyze the constituent elements: cats, she, happily, indicative mood indicator, and but. So cats is obviously truth conditional, explicit, and conceptual. She, on the other hand, is truth conditional, explicit, but procedural. It is the key to the concept. Happily will be non-truth conditional, explicit, conceptual. Indicative mood indicator will be non-truth conditional, explicit, procedural. And but will be non-truth conditional, procedural, and implicit. Implicit in the sense that it is a constraint on implicatures. So it contributes to the implicit level of communication. Thank you for your attention.